Hi everyone, welcome back to the Zone Psychology YouTube channel. My name is Trevor and we're here today with health and performance psychologist John Stevenson, who is the founder of Zone Psychology. And today our topic is Edmonton Psychologist, what to do if you suspect a loved one has ADD. So today our quote is, "I wish people simply knew that ADHD is so much more than just being hyper." And that's from a concerned parent who had a child with ADHD. Here's a quick statistic for everyone. In 2016, National Survey of Children's Health found that less than half of children aged 2 to 7 with ADHD received behavioral treatment in the last year. So that was back in 2016, and I'm sure the numbers are pretty similar to that. So John, tell us a little bit of a story or background about our topic that we're going to be sharing today.
Well, I had a client just before Christmas time where they had gone to another clinic and he suspected that he had ADD, and they did a series of questionnaires, and then they did what we would call a clinical interview. And based on what I would call these subjective measurements, they had given him a diagnosis of ADHD. And in that process, no one had ever asked him had he sustained a concussion. And he actually played high-level football.
Okay.
Played for one of the local teams of the junior football program. And in that time, he had 7 concussions.
Oh my goodness.
Now, one of the things, this is what we're going to talk about today, is having an objective measurement. Because sometimes a concussion can appear like ADHD when in fact it's not. And if you give medication for that, you can actually, in my opinion, cause harm. So what had happened was he came in, we did the QEEG, the brain map, and sure enough, it showed concussion. And then we would treat it quite differently than we would ADD. So I think it's critically important that there's a lot of questions that need to be asked, in my opinion, when you're doing an assessment. Screen time. If someone is doing a lot of screen time, we've had, unfortunately, and especially in the last few months, more and more kids, because of COVID, coming in. And as I mentioned to you earlier, I had a young man in his early 20s that was doing upward to 10 to 12 hours of gaming a day. And if you're doing that, the repercussions to the brain are enormous. And one of the things from a medical point of view is often they have to up that medication to offset screen time. And I think it's really important. One of the things I want to let parents know is that if you do suspect that you're having your child or yourself, I think there's critical things that, whether it be the medical community or me as a psychologist, there's critical things that I think need to be involved in an ADD or ADHD assessment.
Awesome. Well, John, today I've got a number of questions for you about this topic because I feel it's very important for people to understand a little bit more about ADD, ADHD, and what it is and what it isn't. So first question is, what are some of the symptoms of ADD or ADHD in a child?
Well, I'm going to start off neurologically.
Sure.
So when we do a brain scan, we're looking at brain waves. And I'll try to keep this real simple.
Sure, simple for dummies like me.
Brain waves equal how we feel.
Okay.
And so from a neurological, what we'll often see is there's a lot more slower brainwave processing. So if I had the cap on you while you're sleeping, you'd see these really big, slow brainwaves called delta. Great if you're sleeping, not great if you're in the classroom or in the boardroom, and you're needing to pay attention. So there was a very famous researcher named Monastra, and he came up with this what's called the Monastra ratio. And basically what it is delta is sleep, theta is when you're daydreaming, and then there's 2 types of beta brainwaves. Beta 1 is that good external alert focus, and beta 2 is what we call busy brain, anxiety, worry. Now, what we look at is the ratio of fast to slow. And if a client has too much slow brainwave processing compared to the fast brainwave, it's not a question of if, it's going to be the question of what degree are they going to have difficulty paying attention. And one of the things that we will see on the brain scan is a lot more slower brainwave processing, particularly in the prefrontal cortex. And so that's one of the things that we look for in terms of symptomology.
Okay.
So the other thing that we look at is, from a behavioral point of view, there's hyperactivity, there's inattention, there's impulsivity, and then we talk about peer interactions. And so, like for example, for hyperactivity, this is one of the things that we use in our assessment. For a child, excessive running or climbing, difficult sitting still, difficulty staying seated in terms of inattention, often fails to finish things that they start. So what we look at is traditionally, if you go to a psychiatrist or a psychologist, they're going to have what we call these 3 diagnoses, either inattentive, hyperactive, or combined presentation.
Okay.
And so, from an adult's point of view, these are kind of the questions that we ask them. How often do you have trouble wrapping up final, details of a project once, the challenging parts have been done?
I think a lot of people might tick high on that one.
How often do you have difficulty concentrating on what people say to you, even when they're speaking to you directly? So these are the kind of questions that we subjectively ask them. And it's important that we have that.
Right.
But I also think we need objective measurements of a person's, working memory, brain processing speed, their ability to process things quickly and efficiently.
Yeah.
So these are the kind of symptoms that we look. So we look at it from a neurological side, but we also look at it from a behavioral side of things too.
Okay, now this brings me to the next question. So how much of what people think is ADD is actually age appropriate or gender appropriate or for other reasons?
Well, it was interesting. I just was brought this to my attention the other day. I'm actually doing a program right now. They used to call it time management for executives.
Oh, okay, sure.
Okay, and it's the title of this program is called attention management.
Okay.
So, and literally the phrase is control your attention, control your life. And one of the famous, the name escapes me right now, but he's a psychiatrist. And he wrote him and another partner of his wrote a very famous book called Driven to Distraction.
Okay.
And one of the things that just recently he came out and said, in light of social media and all of the things that, more and more and more, and you marketing guys are trying to get our attention.
Right.
And more, it's getting to the point where you almost cannot tell if someone has ADD, and this is one of the leading experts in the world because there's so many things vying for our attention now. I think it's like, the way I would say it is, if it's disrupting your life to the point where you can't do things, and whether it be schoolwork or accomplishing like if it's affecting your personal life and relationships. That's where I'd say if it's your health and well-being and your performance to the degree where it's literally affecting your life, that's where I would say you might want to get an assessment with us.
Get an assessment done. Yeah. No, that's very good. I mean, your smartphone, the big question is your smartphone making you dumb? Because apparently it takes about up to 23 minutes for you to get focus back on once you've been distracted off of a task. And that's pretty serious, especially for not just children, but adults. And I'm not even sure how this is going to affect us going forward as a society. The next question I got for you is, does ADD affect boys and girls differently?
Great question. So generally speaking, so one of the assessments, and maybe jumping a little bit ahead here, but one of the assessments that we use is called the TOVA, Test of Variable Attention. Okay. And it's a 20-minute computerized test that can measure auditory and visual attention. So what happens, I'll give you this little brief description of it, but there's a dot in the middle of the screen, and a box will either appear above or below. And the task is when the box appears above, click the mouse. And when the box appears below, leave it alone.
Right.
So if the box appears at the top and the client misses it, that's what we would call an omission error. That's what we would say more inattentive. If the client responds to the box below, that's what we would call a commission error. And that's where more the impulsivity. Generally speaking, now if a client's making both types of errors, that's where we would say combined presentation. Generally speaking, girls or females tend to have more the inattentive type of ADD. And why this is so critical, in my opinion, Trevor, is that often it can go undiagnosed.
Okay.
Because it could be the child's in the back of the classroom, not disrupting anybody, but just missing a lot of relevant information as to what's going on in the classroom. Generally speaking, for boys or males, they have more the hyperactivity component. But generally speaking, I just had a client come in the other day for ADHD, a young female in her early 20s, and she had combined presentation. And one of the things with the TOVA test that's great, some people lose their focus when they're bored. Some people lose their focus when their central processor gets overwhelmed.
Okay.
And so one of the great things about this assessment, it can show us under what demand conditions people, if they do, make concentration errors, but also what kind of concentration errors do they make. And in this particular situation, this young lady was making more impulsive errors under high demand conditions. So one of the things we've got to be careful about that is if you're in university and you've got a time demand and say it's a multiple choice question, you actually might know your material. But if you also have anxiety as well with that, you could I don't know if you remember, but these and or. And if you're really not taking the time and really paying attention to the detail of that question, you might actually know the answer, but you might go through it so quickly that you respond incorrectly. But generally speaking, females tend to have more the inattentive and males tend to have more the hyperactive component.
No, that's really good information to know because, some people would assume that, girls don't get ADHD because largely goes undiagnosed because it presents in a different way.